Great to have you all here, and thanks so much for joining this second edition of the Responsible Data for Children training, where we are going to have a discussion around how to implement a set of principles around responsible handling of data for and about children, and then also have a more participatory discussion around some of the challenges, pain points, and emerging good practices in identifying and addressing risks related to data handling for children. So this session is going to be 2 hours and 15 minutes in total. We will take a break between the two main pillars of the conversation. As I said, the first hour or so will be really focused on those responsible data principles, some insights from case studies that we have developed on the RD4C team side, and then also some conversation around some tools and methods that we've developed through conversations with UNICEF folks across the institution globally, as well as a network of responsible data practitioners and experts that we've engaged throughout this initiative. So we'll do that for about the first hour and 15 minutes, take a quick coffee break, and then reconvene for a breakout group, small group discussion, where we will have the chance, the most important part of this session, which is hearing from you all on your experiences and pain points and challenges and questions as it relates to responsible data handling, and have a bit of a reflection on emerging practices, and also really inform future trainings that we are eager to develop through this initiative, and making sure that they are aligned with the needs and opportunities as folks like you see them. So that's the plan of attack for today. If we go to the next slide, please, I'll briefly introduce who's here from the team. So I'm Andrew Young. I should have started with that. I'm Andrew Young. I'm the Knowledge Director at the GovLab. GovLab is an action research center based at New York University, and we've been delighted to work with UNICEF for the last few years on the Responsible Data for Children initiative. We're delighted to also have Mark Hereward, the Chief Data Officer, who's going to give some opening remarks to set the stage for this conversation. Eugenia Ilario, the Program Officer and RD4C lead at UNICEF, and our our wonderful partner in crime on all things responsible data for children. I probably shouldn't say partner in crime in the context of data responsibility in children, but you know what I'm getting at. We'll also have Matt Glovinsky, a program specialist and learning passport lead, joining to discuss some of his insights from the learning passport work and how they relate to responsible handling of data for and about children. And my colleagues at GovLab, Andrew Zaranek and Maureen Ragnet, are here as well to share some of their insights around the tools, especially that we've developed, and also helping us to organize the small group discussion in the second hour. So that is who you're going to be hearing from today. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. During the small group discussion, we'll also have a bit of a tour de table so that we can have a better sense of who's joined here today, and get a better sense of kind of where you sit within the institution and some of the your focus areas, again, challenges and pain points as it relates to data. So that is, that's the plan. And now I am delighted to hand it over to Mark to share some opening remarks and give us a sense of what we, of the broader approach to responsible data handling at UNICEF and his new role as Chief Data Officer. So over to you, Mark.
Unmute, I'll get it one day. It's only been a couple of years now, so yeah. So I was just saying thanks, Andrew, and welcome to everybody who's on this call. And it's really exciting to see people not only from headquarters, regional and country levels, but also who are deeply engaged in different stages in the data lifecycle, because data for children covers the whole lifecycle, as I will be saying very soon. So I'm really happy to be here. I am, as Andrew mentioned, in this newly created position of Chief Data Officer for UNICEF. And the Chief Data Officer role was created really to emphasize two different areas of work. One is on data governance, which I summarize as making sure that we're not harming children while we are collecting or using data to be able to help children. And also the more traditional chief data officer role of seeing how we can bring our different data streams together to multiply their value so that we can make better decisions and make more progress in helping children's lives develop. So within data governance, what we're aiming to do is to build systems or at least structures in every office and a culture that ensures responsible data practices in UNICEF and our partners, which means keeping the data suitably private, that the data are collected and used ethically and responsibly, and that the data are of a suitable quality for the purpose to which they are put. So as part of this commitment to good data governance, UNICEF wants to prevent risks across the full life cycle of data at any stage at which data are handled, whether it's data collection or storage or sharing or analysis or use. And this doesn't only apply to personally identifiable data, to personal data, but for any data, but particularly data that could be risky for children in different ways. So personal data gets special attention, but the responsible data use means looking at all of the data that we collect, why we collect it, how we collect it, and what we use it for. This initiative is designed to bring more coherence to these data issues and support all of us, ultimately in delivering services or advocating for government services for children. And while doing so, to understand better the unique risks which come alongside the great opportunities generated at each phase of the data life cycle. So responsible data for children acts as a framework to strengthen the culture of responsible data collection and use, including aspects of data protection, ethics, and sharing. First for us within UNICEF, but definitely our partners and ultimately everybody who is collecting or using data concerning children. So we are organizing a series of capacity building efforts around data governance broadly in 2022 to help strengthen this culture of responsible data practices. And today's training on responsible data for children aims to support regional staff in particular, but country staff, headquarters staff, everybody really, to work together to operationalize RD4C principles, implement the RD4C tools that have been developed, build on lessons learned from UNICEF and partners in using those tools, and bring out challenges and pain points or confusion points that need to be resolved for the future so that we can keep improving the tools we have, the training we give, and the other support that we offer. So the discussions held in the second part of today's session will have will inform a future more comprehensive training program for what I'm calling data stewards in country offices as that rolls out. So we're really grateful for your time today. 2.25 hours is a significant commitment of time. We hope that your interest in this important topic is going to be rewarded, and be active throughout. Please comment, help us keep improving what it is that we can do to be able to help you do your work better for children. So thanks everybody. It's great having you here, and thanks to our GovLab partners and our UNICEF team for bringing this together, and let's make the most of it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mark. I think that really sets the stage. And just to underline, I think the point on participation, chime in, give us comments, questions throughout even the first hour, which is meant to be more of the discussion around the principles and lessons learned and practices. That doesn't mean that it should be only us talking. So please feel free to chime in, and then we'll definitely have a really participatory focus in the second half. So again, thanks so much for being here, and also to underline our appreciation of you spending a full 2 hours and 15 minutes with us, which again is not an insignificant amount of time. So thanks so much for being here. So before we dive in on the principles and lessons learned and tools, just to give you a bit of a sense of what RD4C is. So Responsible Data for Children is a joint endeavor between UNICEF and GovLab at NYU. And it's really aimed at highlighting and supporting best practices in the handling of data for and about children, diagnosing and identifying challenges and developing practical tools, frameworks, lightweight kind of approaches for addressing those challenges. We're big believers in tools rather than technologies as a useful pathway here. So thinking about lightweight checklists and approaches for mapping current practices rather than always jumping to complicated platforms and such. So really want to make things, as Mark said, operational for deploying the principles in different contexts. And then encouraging a broader discussion on these actionable principles, insights, and approaches for responsible data management across UNICEF itself, but also in the space more generally as data for and about children continues to be generated and accumulate across sectors. And the other important element, as Mark was mentioning, is this data lifecycle approach, which we'll talk about a lot over the next hour or so, and really focusing on how we can be more strategic in the identification of opportunities and risks at each stage of that data lifecycle as it relates to responsible data handling for children. So that's the initiative. We're about 2.5 years in to the program, and we've had a number of field visits to different country environments to get a sense of what current practices are, and also had a number of different consultations with folks across the institution to really get a better sense of what those current practices are, as well as the challenges and opportunities going forward, and really thinking about how we synthesize all of that into useful approaches, methods, tools, and insights that can be applied in different contexts. So that's RD4C, and we're eager to continue to learn from you all and continue to. So one of the key, if not the key, frameworks that has informed all things across the RD4C initiative are the RD4C principles, or the 7 Ps that we think are useful, a useful North Star. We shouldn't pluralize North Star, a useful North Star to guide responsible data handling practices in different environments, recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to the complexities of handling data responsibly for children. We use these principles as a framework that can really inform customized and contextual approaches to delivering on the objectives that are represented in these principles. So we have 7 that Eugenia and I will tag team in discussing here, and then also discuss some of the case studies that we've developed and how different examples of current practice really represent and embody those the principles that we're discussing, some challenges in applying the principles, as well as enablers that we've seen start to emerge, as well as tools that can help support your efforts to embody these principles in your work. So that is what we'll do now, and I'm delighted to hand it over to Eugenia to kick us off with our first principle. So over to you, Eugenia. Excuse me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew said, 7 Ps, the 7 principles. We start with the first one, participatory, which is about engaging and informing individuals and groups affected by the use of data for and about children. And this means that at every stage of the data lifecycle, from collection to storage, sharing, analyzing, using, and so forth, we should try to make sure that the perspective of stakeholders and of children especially are captured. And of course, paying attention to marginalized and vulnerable children. And so their perspectives are what guides responsible data practices in a way that is aligned with their needs, their preferences, and their priorities. Next slide, please. So one good example we can give for being participatory is Inform, and I know that there are some people on board who today who worked on that. Inform is an open data kit-based data collection and management tool that centralizes dispersed data streams, secures collected data in a common platform, and enables eventually data analysis and visualization. And it supported a number of emergency responses. So because a deployment requires connecting all these sources held by various parties, it really requires agencies to work together to centralize all these data sources instead of having them engage only with their own data systems and data collection processes. So what are the common challenges and enablers of being participatory? The challenges can be to secure buy-in in all contexts, and then especially maybe during emergencies, partners can have different priorities, and it can be difficult to convince them to join the boat somehow, unless they see it as directly connected to what they need. And the other challenge can be time and resource constraints, and we all know what it is to operate with resource limitations, and that can hamper engagement activities. But on the other hand, the enablers to realize participation include engaging with affected communities, so engaging with local communities, and this can increase awareness on the situation, on the context, and provide insights that we may not otherwise be able to capture and might not be represented in the data. And another enabler is assessing contextual data risks and opportunities, and engagement with experts and affected communities can help identifying these issues, sensitivities, and risks that are related to a specific environment. And with this, we go to the second principle.
Great, thanks, Eugenia. So our second key is focused on being professionally accountable. And here we think about that in terms of operationalizing those responsible data practices and principles by establishing institutional processes, roles, and responsibilities. And here we really think about recognizing that it is useful to have policies, guidance, frameworks, and principles that, as I said, can act as that North Star around which to orient different practices. But if there aren't steps to really embed those in the day-to-day standard operating procedures and establish a human infrastructure and lines of responsibility and accountability for actually putting those different elements into practice, then the responsible data approaches are unlikely to really take hold and have an impact. So being professionally accountable is very much a central principle for this work. Next slide, please. And one example of that we saw in our field work and one of the case studies, and I should say that each of these case studies that we're going to be referencing throughout this conversation are available on the Responsible Data for Children website, as well as the tools that we'll discuss. So we'll make sure to share links to everything with folks so you can take a look at all of this in more detail. But a great example of a professional accountability in practice that we saw came from the Afghanistan Nutrition Online Database, which is an information management system aimed at providing different useful indicators around nutrition to implementing partners, UNICEF staff, government partners, and the like, and really making that information as available as possible to folks who can put it to use. Recognizing those different stakeholders involved in the implementation and use of the system, the team behind it at UNICEF took a number of steps to ensure those lines of professional accountability across institutions and users. And some of those involve things like training initiatives and capacity building very early in the process to ensure that folks who were using the system had a good sense of how to handle the data effectively and safely and ethically. There were also a number of items of collateral that were developed, like manuals and guidance that really focused on good practices, especially around things like avoiding unauthorized access to certain records or data streams that might create some kind of sensitivity. And related to that, the guidance had a real focus on maintaining an up-to-date user list and conducting regular checks and assessments of those access provisions and the people who are actually logging onto the system to ensure that that all is approved and appropriate and aligned with expectations around who should have access to what types of information. And then really, again, a focus on recognizing when people should no longer have access to systems, providing a real guidance on how to go about assessing and blocking and removing the access of users after they should no longer be able to engage with the system, for instance, after they leave the organization. So a number of different steps really to implement those principles around professional accountability, especially through training and that clear focus on accountability and who can access what at which times. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges and enablers for professional accountability, there are several, and a few that we'll mention here include that fragmentation that can sometimes come into play. As I mentioned, whenever there are stakeholders from different institutions and with different objectives and missions engaging with the same system, it can be a challenge really to understand and deploy common standards, principles, and ways of working, recognizing that there are different decision-making processes, different objectives, and different ways of working across implementing partners. So ensuring that more holistic and joined up type of approach to implementing this work can be a problem or a challenge to be mitigated. So addressing that fragmentation concern, and relatedly, really embedding these good practices, as I was mentioning at the start of this principle, making sure that policies and practices aren't just found on a document somewhere on an intranet, but are actually being embedded and changing the way that people operate on a day-to-day basis, and improving standard operating procedures. So making sure that those practices actually filter down into everyday work. Enablers, as we saw in the Afghanistan Nutrition Online Database, managing internal access is an important enabler of maintaining professional accountability, and also establishing an audit trail of when different users engage with or access different records or data streams, so that there's always a clear understanding of who is accessing what. And then finally, leading into the discussion of our first tool, really defining those lines of responsibility and accountability can be an important enabler of recognizing where good practices are happening and addressing any gaps that might create risks around responsible data handling. So across the data lifecycle, identifying the different activities and especially decision points that come into play, and which parties, which stakeholders, which individuals are actually responsible for and accountable for making those decisions, and having that information really well-defined and shared across partners can guard against confusion or gaps in practice by having that clear understanding of who's responsible and accountable for what. So those are our challenges and enablers, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague, the other Andrew, to talk about our first tool.
So as Andrew Young noted, one of the needs that we encountered in our work on professional accountability is making sure that there's it's clear sort of who's involved in the processes, and ensuring that there's clear lines of accountability. One of the ways in which we sought to promote this principle was by developing a decision provenance mapping tool, which is inspired by the notion of data provenance, how data comes about, and really tries to identify how decisions themselves come about. So this tool, which you can find a link to at the bottom of this slide, uses the RACI matrix in terms of identifying how organizations can be responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed around different aspects of the data lifecycle. So the actual tool itself is a series of prompts in a table format, asking organizations to consider questions like who is responsible for the activities of collection and transfer, who is accountable for them, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. The tool as a whole is meant to address many of the questions that you see here, Are the roles and mandates defined and understood? Is the decision flow sufficiently transparent? Is there communication between decision makers across the data lifecycle? And are decision-making processes captured by knowledge management systems? So again, in short, it's the goal is to identify key decision points and determine those who need to be involved, whether they be stakeholders, partners, or outside beneficiaries who might have a role to play in this work. And happy to pass it back to Eugenia, I think, for the next principle, people-centric.
Thank you, Andrew. So the third principle is people-centric, which is about ensuring the needs and expectations of children, their caregivers, and their communities are prioritized by the actors handling data for and about them, which means, for instance, that children and or their caregivers have consented to the data use in question, and that they have a clear understanding of how the work will be conducted. And what we want to prioritize with this is the value of data from a human perspective, the value it can create for children in particular, and not just data for the sake of having data or for procedural benefits. So one good example we can give for being people-centric is the Aurora project, which is a child protection platform developed by UNICEF Romania and partners. And the system enables social workers and community healthcare providers to diagnose and monitor vulnerabilities experienced by children and their families. And the platform is people-centric, among other things, because its components were crafted in recognition really of the influence and the importance of stakeholders, not just of children's experiences and needs, but also those of their caregivers. Some of the common challenges, again, and enablers that we can see for this principle, one of the common challenge to be people-centric is clarifying the public perspectives. Even with a public-centric approach, it can be tricky to understand what children and their communities think are important or inappropriate uses of data for and about them. So to counterbalance these challenges, there are some enablers that include to prioritize creating human value. As we said, the effective data use can create many benefits, including efficiency gains and procedural benefits, but a responsible approach prioritizes benefits for children and their communities over process improvements. Another enabler can be to scrutinize inferred data prior to use. Inferred personal data is information about a child that can be interpreted through multiple pieces of existing data. And so making sure that this information is assessed prior to use could help putting in place a more people-centric approach. Next slide, please.
Great, and then on to our fourth P, which is prevention of harms across the data lifecycle. And here we think about what we frame as an end-to-end data responsibility approach, which, as we've discussed, really focuses on assessing risks and opportunities at each stage of the data lifecycle, from planning through collecting, storing, preparing, sharing, analyzing, and ultimately using data for and about children, and really recognizing that those risks and opportunities can emerge at different stages and accumulate as the process moves throughout that data lifecycle. We often make the point that data is in many ways a process rather than a thing, and focusing on certain concepts like privacy or bias or security, while obviously important, taking that approach rather than a life cycle approach could lead to certain issues being unrecognized or not appropriately addressed. So thinking about those issues at each stage of the life cycle can really provide a more comprehensive and kind of holistic assessment of those risks and opportunities, and also provide more insight on how best to address them in different ways. So next slide, please. And a good example that we've seen from our case studies comes from the MIX, and I'm sure that folks here are familiar with the MIX household surveys. but specifically we focused on the 2019 deployment in Zimbabwe around household surveys on domestic violence, and the first instance of a domestic violence module in the mix, and obviously really focused on how to counteract the issues around a lack of data on the incidence of domestic and gender-based violence. Clearly a pretty sensitive type of data stream to be collecting. And the way that the mix team has really approached that prevention of harms across the data lifecycle was through two kind of pillars, one being a human-centric or human infrastructure type approach, and the other being more technical in nature. So from the human side, during the survey collection process and interview process, the team established what we term as rigid checks for quality and accuracy of all of the information being collected and generated, cross-checking information at different stages to ensure that what's being captured is accurate, relevant, and appropriate. And then from the technical perspective, using a secure cloud server for managing the storage, preparation, and access to the data to approved national implementing partners and colleagues across UNICEF. So taking that human infrastructure and technical infrastructure approach in tandem is a good indicator of how stakeholders can ensure that prevention of harms across the data lifecycle. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges and enablers, this assessment of opportunities and risks at each stage of the life cycle can be time intensive, and that's something that we recognize in all of our offerings here, is the recognition that taking the time to be thoughtful and strategic in identifying and addressing those risks is not something that can be done with a push of a button in many cases. There is some kind of time and resource implication on this type of assessment. So what we are always trying to do is think about how we can identify what's mission critical, what's essential in terms of those risk identification and mitigation processes, so that we don't have this focus on data responsibility have a chilling effect on the use of data. Because as Mark said in his opening remarks, we really want to focus this work on a responsibility to protect data for and about children, but also a responsibility to put data to use when it can actually improve children's lives and help them deliver on their potential. So we don't want this to be a presentation and a training that has you walking out thinking, to do data responsibility right is going to be so much time and resource strain that it's not even worth pursuing. So recognizing that there are those challenges and potential delays in implementing this type of approach is something that we recognize and really think about how best to navigate it to ensure that we strike the balance between agility and velocity of innovation and use of data, as well as making sure that we're being safe, ethical, and protective of children's information. A second challenge relates to identifying group data risks at each stage of the data lifecycle. So not just at UNICEF, but more broadly, policies, principles, guidelines tend to be very focused on personally identifiable information, which have clear sensitivities and risks associated with them. But often the more aggregated type of data streams or statistical level data streams can be considered as relatively safe and secure, when in fact there are certain risks that can emerge to groups of children based on more aggregated data, whether it be through things like the mosaic effect, where aggregated data can be compiled together with other data streams to potentially re-identify or provide actionable information around certain groups, or opportunities to, for example, around location information, target certain communities and have actionable information on groups of children, including potentially demographic groups or other risky types of information streams, and really recognizing that those group data risks exist and can be somewhat more difficult to diagnose and address So keeping that in mind at each stage of the data life cycle, not just the personal risk, but also the group data risks, is a challenging ongoing focus for this work. In terms of enablers, we start with really due diligence on the policy ecosystem and previous practice in a certain realm, recognizing that UNICEF is not subject to national legal frameworks per se in its operations. Implementing partners often are, and users of the system and beneficiaries might have certain, their engagement with the system might have certain implications. So being really clear and have a clear understanding of legal and policy frameworks that might affect a data system or a data initiative can be really valuable, as well as due diligence on existing or previously deployed services, guidance, and capacities can be useful to improve the approach and also learn from past failures, identify potential collaborators, or really learn from what's been done before to improve and bolster new practices. And then finally, as we touched on already a few times in this conversation, taking that life cycle approach to risk identification and opportunity identification can be really important, and taking that step-by-step approach to diagnosing and examining those risks and opportunities can be really useful to guard against oversights in practice. So that is the overview of the prevention of harms. And now I'll hand it over to Marie to talk a little bit about our first tool that can really support this work. So over to you, Marie.
Thanks. Yeah, so this tool offers the opportunity to review opportunities and risks for a specific data project or system. And it takes the form of a roadmap with questions and resources that lets organizations take stock of the ORDI4C principles and how they might be realized. It's intended to help users identify areas in need of attention and strategize possible next steps to ensure a more responsible handling of data. And this is important because avoiding unintended consequences on data subjects requires organizations handling data to understand what dangers they need to be cognizant of, and because maximizing benefits requires users to be able to proactively act on opportunities. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Maureen. So as you might have guessed from some of the previous sections, one of the things that we're big fans of at RD4C and at the GovLab is questions. So we developed this tool, which is the 22 questions to assess responsible data for children. It's intended as an assessment or an audit guide for someone who is involved with starting up or has some other kind of role with any kind of data initiative. As the title of this tool suggests, it's a series of 22 questions, not arranged sequentially, but according to why, what, who, how, when, and where, that are intended to guide a practitioner through the aspects that they need to be aware of or consider while they're trying to proactively promote responsible data for children. So you can see on the left of the screen, one example of that. One of the questions being, what are the questions that can be answered through the use of data? It provides a brief note on the principles that it relates to most closely. Provides a space for the individual to develop a response to that question based upon the work that they're currently undergoing. And then on the far right of that table, provide some recommendations based upon the case studies and independent research about how generally that question might be answered. So again, these 22 questions go through a variety of different components of an initiative, from collection to processing, analysis, through use of data, all the aspects of the data lifecycle. And the overall goal is to help actors move quickly and on urgent challenges, as well as act on the opportunities that they may face in the field. And that's the 22 questions. So I'll pass it back to Eugenia.
Thank you, Andrew. And maybe worth mentioning that the 22 questions were originally used for the audit of 2 large-scale data projects in UNICEF, one of which is the Learning Passport, and Mac is going to talk about this in a bit. So the 22 questions you see online are the public access version of what was originally used to audit these UNICEF programs. So now I go to the 5th principle, which is proportionality, which means aligning the breadth of data collection and duration of data retention with the intended purpose, which means that the collection, retention, and use of data should be relevant, limited, and adequate to what is necessary to achieve the intended purpose, the reason why you need that data. And a very good example, and an organization with whom we have collaborated a lot, is Childline Kenya. Next slide, please. And Childline Kenya is a helpline offering services for children with protection issues throughout Kenya. And at the start of each call, the counselor informs the child, the person who calls, that the discussion will be recorded, but all the information provided will remain confidential and accessible only by a limited number of people, i.e. case management personnel, unless it needs to be shared with service providers for a specific authorized / legally required referral. So what are, again, the typical challenges faced to realize proportionality? One of them is around avoiding duplicate data. And it is difficult to avoid the collection and storage of duplicative data, not only between agencies, but also really within the same organization. And this data duplication can have a number of negative impacts, including on the relations with children and data subjects in general. So some of the enablers can be to consider data's relevance and value over its lifespan. And to identify this, we should not only think about what is necessary to achieve the intended purpose, but also look at the sort of contextual framework, what laws are applicable, organizational policies, and so forth. Also ensure legitimacy of reuse. Many applications of data for children are the result of secondary use, which means the use of data for something other than its initial purpose. So it's important to identify these uses and ensure that they're considered appropriate in the communities in which they operate, but also destroy outdated and superfluous data. Data users should have a clear process for identifying when and why data about children should be retained, when it should be archived, and when it should be destroyed to avoid accumulating risks for minimal value or using data that is actually no longer relevant or applicable. Next slide, please. Andrew Young, you haven't unmuted.
Sorry, I was on mute. It was going to happen eventually over the course of this training. So moving to our 6P is a focus on being protective of children's rights. And here we think about this in terms of recognizing the distinct rights and requirements related to data responsibility for helping children develop to their full potential. Throughout our work on RD4C, many of the approaches that we advocate for and that we are seeking to implement are data responsibility principles and approaches that would be applicable for all communities. Data responsibility is important for everyone, but we also really want to be cognizant of the unique challenges, risks, rights, and requirements for children specifically, and establish a sense of what processes and approaches should be deployed when we're talking about the unique context of data for and about children. And having that kind of children's rights-based approach across all activities can be, again, a useful North Star around which to orient activities. Next slide, please. So again, looking at Childline Kenya, some activities that they have deployed have been really useful for taking that rights-based approach and really centering children's rights across activities. We talked a little bit before about having that monitoring and evaluation of who's accessing, editing, deleting, or printing client records to ensure that that is well established ahead of time and aligned with what's appropriate for who should have information on children in very sensitive situations if they're engaged with Childline Kenya. And also a number of steps that have been taken to ensure that users of the Childline data systems and data repositories are have the appropriate credentials and restrictions on how they should access data and in which cases they can actually use the data that, again, is quite sensitive in nature given the protection issues that would lead to a child engaging with Childline Kenya. One good example of that kind of rights-based approach to certain provisions and restrictions in the system is the Childline Kenya data system actually ensures that staff only have access to those sensitive client records while physically present at the Childline premises and connected to its network. So having that information only accessible when physically connected to the server. We learned from Martha Sunda, the executive director of Childline Kenya yesterday, actually, that there were certain steps taken to create remote access to some of that data in the context of the pandemic. But to do that, they worked closely with UNICEF and other partners to ensure that that was done in a really data responsible, privacy protective, and security protective type of way. So again, recognizing the shifts and emerging challenges that can come into play whenever dealing with something like a global pandemic. That can change practices, but always orienting those shifts in approach around a rights-based approach for children can be a useful way to ensure responsibility, even when there are those shocks or transitions. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges and enablers, across all of this work and across the data ecosystem, we often advocate for an approach that takes a keeping data as open as possible while as closed as necessary, so that we can really focus on, again, that dual nature of data responsibility as we discuss it, and the focus on how can we take a responsibility to use data when it can provide value, including enabling the reuse of data by parties that can help to create value for children, while also being really focused on the responsibility to protect data and ensure children's privacy and security. But while enabling that as open as possible element and enabling the reuse of data by partners and other stakeholders, there can be less of a tight control over those secondary uses, and ensuring that secondary use of data provided is still respective of children's rights and really aligned around that rights-based approach for children can be a bit of a challenge. So being cognizant of those secondary use issues and how they might have implications on the rights-based approach is an important challenge to take stock of. In terms of enablers, one frame that we often use to help conceptualize the data responsibility for children space is really looking at data as an extension of the child. So the child's, especially immutable personal information, really considering that as an extension of their physical person. And having that frame and that analogy for what data really is can be a useful guide for ensuring that data handling is really rights-based and respective of the unique rights and responsibilities for children. A good way to guide activities across the data lifecycle, and including secondary uses like we were just discussing, is advancing a risk and sensitivity tagging approach. So recognizing that different types of data have different risks and sensitivities, whether they be things like biometric or health data or data about children in conflict areas. There are unique and amplified risks to certain types of information streams,
as well as what we sometimes call bad data, or data sets that have unknown or known inaccuracies, biases, or other quality issues, which can have a negative influence on downstream analysis and use. Recognizing, tagging, and making visible those risks, sensitivities, challenges, deficits in those data sets, so that all parties who might put those information streams to use for analysis or informing certain activities, ensuring that those issues are really visible and those sensitivities are visible, can ensure that the data handling downstream is aligned with what's really necessary to ensure that data is used safely and effectively. So that risk and sensitivity tagging is something that we'll discuss more, especially in the participatory element and the small group discussion later, but an important approach that can ensure that protection of children's rights. And back to you, Eugenia, for last but not least.
So the last but very, very important principle is purpose-driven, which is about identifying and specifying why the data is needed and how the intended or potential benefits relate to improve children's lives. So identifying the purpose and understanding how this purpose can help benefit children's life in a meaningful way, ultimately. A good example is, again, the one from Inform that we have mentioned earlier already. So this is the data collection, visualization, and management tool we've talked about. How is it purpose-driven? Inform was developed with a user-centric design approach to ensure that the tool would be useful for compiling and visualizing data eventually. And so the Inform team launched a small interagency pilot in Somalia with multi-stakeholder workshops to determine how to best operate the tool. And Inform received revisions in responsive feedback, adding new features and ways to visualize data. So some challenges and enablers to conclude with all the principles. Partner might have different priorities, and this can be a challenge, which can hamper the purpose-driven nature of a data program. So this requires parties to have a common understanding of their roles, their expectations, of which data is most important for the immediate context and how to integrate it into the system. Some enablers include to articulate intended actions, so establish a legitimate purpose for information collection prior to collection, and understand what data is required for the project, why and for how long. Another one is to define objectives and establish metrics, clearly define the project goals and only collect data directly relevant to meeting those goals. And last but importantly in the RD4C work is to avoid the missed uses, the missed opportunities of using data. Misuse of data is when useful data exists or could exist but is not used. And misuse can be avoided by reviewing all the available data sets and using them to solve problems when such use or reuse is appropriate and legitimate. So as Andrew said, all these 7 principles were established as a North Star to guide all our work, and we hope that you have seen that there are practical ways with the existing RD4C tools, among other resources, to align your work with all these principles. And the data ecosystem mapping tool that we're going to present shortly is a good way to answer all these questions, and especially this purpose-driven one, the why question, helping those handling children's data reflect really on the purpose of their data systems and activities.
Thanks, Eugenia. Yeah, as you mentioned, this tool is a good way to conclude because it brings together all of the principles that we've discussed throughout this training. So it takes the form of a spreadsheet to help users identify the systems generating data about children and the key components of these systems. And it provides a framework to capture the why the system exists. So is it purpose-driven? Is it people-centric? Is it proportional? Who is involved? Is it professionally accountable? Is it participatory? What data is held? Is it protective of children's rights? Does it prevent harm across the data lifecycle? And so this is intended to help organizations understand the breadth of data an organization generates and holds about children and assess potential redundancies and gap, or identify potential opportunities for responsible data use as well as other insights. And again, all these tools are available on the RD4C website, all the tools that we've mentioned with the principles. Next slide, please. And I think it's time for a guest speaker.
Great, and thanks so much, Maureen, and thanks everyone for bearing with us while we gave you a crash course in a whole lot of content, and hopefully some useful insights and recommendations that have come out of our work to date. And now I'm delighted to introduce Matt Glovinsky, who has joined us today to share a bit of his thoughts and reflections on responsible data for children as it relates to his work around the Learning Passport and also more generally. So delighted to have you here, Mac. And we have a few questions, but maybe I'll start by just handing it over to you for any initial thoughts or reflections on how you approach responsible data for children in your work.
Great, thanks guys. Hi everyone, I'm Mac. I'm the Global Chief of the Learning Passport, which if you haven't heard of it, is an enterprise digital learning system run out of UNICEF headquarters, developed with some technical partnership in Microsoft and a number of other people, delivering digital education services to all sorts of kids all over the world. We were really excited to get into this responsible data for children work because we have a fun role of being a system and a team that has a ton of exposure with governments. So when, as a alumni of Eugenia's team, I knew some of this work going on, and as early on in my role here, I approached Eugenia, or put our hand up to say, we'd love for the Learning Passport to be included in the RD4C work because of what I saw, maybe ambitiously, is the work that we do with governments around the data that we gather, and I can go into that in a second. But that was a little bit ago, and as the program has expanded, there's like 22 countries now, 2.2 million users. We'll probably hit 5 before the end of this year, and we're involved in a number of types of different contexts. I knew that we were going to have some guidance in terms of how we would not just talk to UNICEF about the way that we manage data, but talk to government partners with the way that we manage data. And I went into this expecting that the Andrews and the GovLab team and working with Eugenia would come back with a number of recommendations using the principles that they apply to the analysis, saying, don't do this, don't do that, be careful about what you're doing here, be careful about what you're doing there. More about like data sheriffs, if you will, out there kind of enforce some law. And so they went through a lot of what we do. We gather very basic information on students or learners and teachers, right? Which is customizable in every country we deploy the Learning Passport in, meaning no two countries are the same, no two data sets are the same. And what we needed was principles to kind of look at things. We couldn't make hard and fast rules around things, around what countries want to do or what they didn't want to do. So we have tons and tons of data, but it is not as sensitive as things like Primero or the HOPE system or a lot of the other stuff that the participants here may be aware of, or that Eugenia and Andrew and the team have looked at in terms of extremely sensitive, life-threatening data around children. However, that's not to say that we didn't really need to take a very serious approach to the fact that we have names, we have genders, we have grades, we have some type of stuff, and we have governments saying, hey, can we put in someone's home address? Hey, can we put in a national ID number? So that to me was kind of expected. What the teams came back with, being like, you may want to consider the fact that this data is sensitive, and what are you going to use it for? There was a real practical application of things that I found to be quite useful. So that was very good. We deal with, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this type of problem in that governments often want to gather as much as they possibly can without a lot of rationale behind the why are they doing that, right? And so I needed the tools in the toolkit to not just say, well, don't do that, but to say, here, there's a principled way to approach and understand this. We have an analytical framework that we can apply to this problem and tell you the whys and the whys behind the whats, right? Like, what are you trying to do? Well, why would we do that? So we have done this in consultation with a number of different governments. It's actually been a pretty useful tool to talk about. This isn't just the LP team talking. This isn't just data privacy talking. This is actually, if you want to have a deeper conversation around this in the technical aspect in the line ministry, we can go there. The fun part with me is what the teams came back with what, not to stop doing things, but to tell us to do a lot more around things. I wasn't expecting the results of our audit to essentially come back and say, you should consider doing more with this data. You should consider a lot of the good things that you can do. So there's a real positive aspect in this, which is very nice for me, because it's not nice to go to a government and say no, right? We're not necessarily even allowed to do that so much in my world. We can advise, we can suggest, but our audit came back to say, there were two main things. Think about what you can do with this data more, right? Think about the positive applications of what you guys are doing, which that was fully a surprise. Like when I read the report, I was not expecting a positive look. And I thought that the team really embraced the fact that we're in the trenches with these governments in a relatively new program space of digital learning and enterprise learning. And so there wasn't a very clear map to go by. And so that was something very good. The other thing that came out of this that we're working now was we need to develop our own privacy policy in terms of use that humans could understand. So not like if you have 3 law degrees and are very into the classical UNICEF speak that I can't understand. What does a user need to know about what you're doing here? And so from that, we are actually developing terms of service, privacy policies that are specific to us, not just for UNICEF. Because we read the UNICEF ones, I think, with the guidance of the team, and no human could really understand what that meant, right? And so we're dealing with a lot of humans. We're really friendly in front of a lot of governments. We needed the tools to continue that positive positioning of the Learning Passport, and reflexively UNICEF as a whole, as a helpful organization, but also one that put real human users at the center of things. And so we're halfway through, or we're actually more than halfway through it. We've been working with the different colleagues across the organization to bring a more like average human-centered approach to the way that we understand and talk about data. And we do now have, in terms of this audit, and I was actually just looking at it before the call, it's great. And I think we can share it, right, Eugenia? I think so. I mean, yeah.
You mean the audit?
Yeah.
You decide. It's yours.
We'd be happy. I mean, to keep it inside the UNICEF family, I think it's highly illustrative of a lot of the stuff we're doing, and it does give us also a path forward in terms of incremental changes we can make, and then some larger kind of systemic changes we can make. So we were quite pleased. I was really pleased because it put us in a positive position with governments, right? We didn't go in and start slapping people's wrists. We actually said, here's some informed ways to do this. Here's some principles underneath it. Here's ways to think and talk about the way that we gather data. But it was very much in a positive frame, like, do more with this. You guys are gathering some interesting stuff. Think about it. But also, there are humans on the under end of these systems, and humans need to understand what's happening, right? And from that suggestion, I read some of like some privacy policies of kind of newer technology organizations, like the emerging thinking around this. And it's very much like, if you're 10 years old, you can kind of understand what's going on here. And so that is, we've set some targets and some goals on realizing those things. But it also gave us some more tools in the toolkit to talk about data from principles, right? Instead of it saying bad and good, a lot of the whys. So we were very pleased with the outcomes of the report, and I was really glad to be one of the first 2 organizations. I think that we should have a lot more of this across UNICEF and the systems that we use, understanding that I'm like a happy, friendly system, right? It's just learning content and some very light PIA around individuals. But when you're talking with ministries, they'll want to say, let's gather as much stuff as possible. And this kind of toolkit allowed us to talk about why one would do that, what we would advise, what we find useful, etc. So that's kind of been the LP experience. I do think that we can share the report. Maybe let's have Pragya look at it just to make sure that there's nothing in there that we would be embarrassed about if it made it anywhere, but I don't think we really are. And I do think that when we get this privacy policy written too in the TOS, we would also like to put that in terms of a compendium of organization-wide things about what this should look like, right? Because those type of things, there are not a lot of experts in UNICEF about, right? That's why the GovLab guys are with us. We don't really have a deep bench in this type of work. However, I'm sure that most of you guys are on the call and would agree, there are more and more digital aspects to the way that UNICEF does its program business. And in that aspects, we were just going to gather more data around kids or partners or whatever. And so those type of things are important for us to not only understand the what, but the why, and then have some pretty good examples of what good looks like. So those are kind of my reflections. I don't know if I'm happy to take any questions, or if the Andrews told me that I totally blew it, or Eugenia, if I missed a major thing, just let me know. But yeah, I think let's review. We'll share the report. I also think that we're happy to share our, the privacy policy and the TOS as we get those done, and to really we're happy to continue to contribute to the organization. I think that it's also a good hygiene thing to do if you're running big systems. So yeah, just overall pleased.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Mac, for that, and great to hear that it was a positive and useful experience. I will say that Eugenia is the responsible data sheriff. We're just the deputies here, but I think that was a really important point on, as we talked about briefly before, thinking about data responsibility as a responsibility to provide value through data as well as protection, and really thinking about data from a generative perspective. I think that we, in a lot of our work and through this initiative, in some ways are seeking to counteract what we sometimes see as a narrative around data as toxic, which I think is not the same thing as recognizing that data can be sensitive or risky. So kind of balancing that recognition that data is powerful, and data can provide powerful benefits. It can also provide powerful risks in certain cases, and being thoughtful about how we can get the best from data, but also avoid the worst is really how we want to approach all of this work.
Yeah. And I think that from my, the classicist perspective is data is terrifying versus the government is data is empowering. I need to know everything. And that's a false polarity. Right. I think that there's a lot of nuance in between, and that's what I think the exercise, and hopefully UNICEF is kind of emerging into understanding that it is not a binary kind of relationship here, and that there is a lot of positive things you can do, and everyone's coming from a good place, right? The governments want to know, and no one is bad actors in the space, but I do think that the nuanced response is we just have to get there, right? That's what's moving elsewhere in the space, and I think that UNICEF needs to lead by example as well. Sorry to cut you off, Andrew, but I thought that
that's helpful. And I was just going to say, if anyone has a question for Mac, I think we have a few more minutes before we're going to move to the coffee break. But any questions from the participants or reflections on what Mac just shared?
Yeah, and I was going to have Pragya here too, who's my lead on this, but we are so neck deep in Ukraine right now that it is kind of it's a bit hectic. Totally. But we will apply these principles to the work we're doing in Ukraine, right? So that's good stuff.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, and thanks for making the time. I know how, well, I don't know, I can imagine how hectic things are. I don't see any questions, so maybe I'll jump in with just one quick one, Mac, which is you talked a lot about the engagement with governments and how this kind of background and show and demonstration of how this aligns with certain practices and principles and a broader understanding of these issues can be valuable. I'm eager to hear whether you have any reflections on the engagement with Microsoft and any kind of data responsibility considerations that were part of those discussions, or the collaboration with that kind of private sector actor, anything that kind of comes to mind from a data responsibility perspective when working with a private sector vendor in that case.
Yeah, it's so funny depending on where you are, right? Some people you walk in the door and say Microsoft, and people say, oh wow, Microsoft. And some people you walk in the door and you say Microsoft, and they say, oh god, Microsoft. I think that, again, demonstrating my naivety about this, we walked in and we'd be like, hey, Microsoft's policies are pretty bulletproof, we can just lean on those, that's good, right? They've thought about this, etc. Not the case. So for me, I think, and a lot of our stuff in Learning Passport is, we have to push Microsoft to get them to do what is right for us, right? Their stock toolkit of things sometimes is out of the box and it works, but their privacy policy around the customer policy for the UNICEF tenants, etc., was not suitable for a conversation with the government, and didn't have as much of an analytical lens as to the whys of things, right? It is just the whys of things. If they're not everyone's going to want to talk to you about it, but some people do. And to have a way to walk people through a conversation as to understanding what the data means, what we can do with it, what we don't want to do with it, etc., that's pretty good. So I think that it's allowed us to kind of push Microsoft a little bit to say that, yeah, thanks for your terms of service, but those really aren't going to cut it on our end, and we're going to need to adapt this. And so it really spoke to the fact that as UNICEF, we needed to develop our own thing. What I wanted to be able to do was just say, here's the Microsoft TOS that applies to the UNICEF corporate Azure subscription. We own all the stuff. They don't use it, etc. Do we really know that? I don't know. That's another debate. But is that suitable for our approach to governments? Thinking that we work, with children and we should be able to talk to them about what we're doing with their data? No way close. So for me, it's helped nudge them, and I think that the answer with Microsoft is it's a oh great and an oh god at the same time, right? My job really is to channel them into doing things that are good for the organization, the Learning Passport, and the larger approach to what they do in terms of their interlocution with Microsoft, or with UNICEF, and their participation in different programs in different places, etc. A lot of my day is about that. So I think that the larger lesson here is, if you're like Google, Microsoft, whatever, like, don't just be like, they're great, because they need a bit of work too when applied to our contexts, which is a different bag. It's a different thing. So for me, it was interesting, but it also meant that we had to do a bit more work than I would have hoped to do, because we need things for us, right? That their conditions did not necessarily completely apply to consultations with government ministries. And you have some of the ministries that got really into the legalistic agreements around it. Like the Jamaican ministry sent three lawyers to go through everything, and they said, we still have some questions, which is like the worst thing for me to hear. So that kind of stuff is where at face value, it wasn't good enough, right? We had to kind of continue down the track a little bit. But having a megalithic partner like that is fun, because there are smart people over there that can think about it with you. So we like, the development of our terms of service, we're actually running some stuff by their guys to understand implications in terms of technology and the evolution of technologies, etc.
Awesome. That's really valuable insight, and yeah, this certainly resonates with some of our discussion around what's unique about children, what's unique about this context, and it's not what's going to be relevant for the umbrella set of activities that, as you said, a megalithic corporation like Microsoft or Google might be used to working with. So I think that's really valuable.
And they're also really used to having things their own way, right? But I think that as we've moved with Microsoft, they've been like, oh wow, UNICEF actually has some pretty smart people over there too, and our partnerships, and we can talk about in the depth. How far do you want to go? I will sit there and debate with you, Microsoft. And so they've taken us a lot more seriously too when we come to them with really informed stuff, being like, you guys got a hole here, like we need to talk about that. You know what I mean? And I think that is, maybe I don't know if that was the purpose of the work, Eugenia, but it is a byproduct of this work that we are as capable, smart, and literate and fluent in concepts when dealing with companies that people necessarily wouldn't put UNICEF in the same box with. Like, I can go talk to Microsoft on a very deep technical level about a number of things, and with this type of frameworks behind them, we have the ways to talk about data protection on a deep level, technical, get the experts over there. They're not smarter than us in that way. I hope no one from Microsoft is on the call.
I don't think so. But
happy
really,
we all look smarter with this work.
That's the core objective of this is help everyone look smart, which is important, and not that you all need it.
That's a hard job for me though, but we don't need it. Spend another.
Not at all. But thank you again, Mac. This has been incredibly valuable. You're of course welcome to stick around for the second hour, but I know that the Ukraine situation certainly needs your attention and expertise. So we'll let you go. But again, thank you so much for doing this, and really appreciate the insights.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. Anyone on the call, any questions, shoot me an email, etc. We're available. See ya.
Awesome. Thanks, Mac.